because we don't believe in fear or hate, but we believe in faith and we believe in love.
We certainly need to come together, because at some point people come from different countries, but when we come here we can all become Americans, and God can bless us.
Sometimes in our lives we all have pain, we all have sorrow, but if we are wise, we know that there's always tomorrow.
Grant peace to the world, every hour and every season. Beat our swords into plowshares, turn our hatred into love. Grant peace.
It is an enormous honor to be here on this bimah, where I was bat mitzvahed and confirmed, and to have the opportunity to share with you the civil rights story that I've become very passionate about. Glen Echo Park, the national park, which is on the site of the former Glen Echo Amusement Park, was a mecca of my childhood. We were regulars at Adventure Theater, and my father learned to turn wood there, and my mother learned glass. And as teenagers, my friends and I were irresistibly attracted to the ghostly aura of the former amusement park, and we would get adolescent thrills by climbing onto the rooftop, trespassing onto the rooftop of the old shooting gallery. It always felt like if we stood still enough, the wind would carry the squeals of delight from people on the roller coaster or the tilt-a-whirl. Glen Echo made me nostalgic for a time that I never knew. Because we were Glen Echo regulars, I was shocked and then ashamed to discover my ignorance of the fact that less than 20 years before I went to day camp in this beloved place that so sparked my imagination, the Jewish owners of Glen Echo Amusement Park forbid African Americans from entering, from having all the fun that the white kids did, like hearing Tommy Dorsey play at the Spanish Ballroom or swan diving into Crystal Pool. There are gorgeous pictures, black and white pictures of those olden days, but they were actually portraying racism, and I hadn't seen it, because everyone in those pictures are white. I was considering having my wedding reception at Glen Echo Park when my now husband and I met Sam Swirsky. He is a Menschlich park ranger with a historian's instincts, and he told us the story of the unprecedented collaboration that helped integrate Glen Echo Amusement Park in 1960. As the rabbi mentioned, in the late spring, inspired by the sit-ins in Greensboro that made national headlines, a group of students at Howard University gathered to take on segregation close to home. They called themselves NAG, the Nonviolent Action Group, and with a few white people who found their way in, they sat down at segregated lunch counters in Arlington. Hecklers called them horrible names. One threw a lit cigarette. Another poured water over one gentleman's head as he sat quietly reading the Bible on his stool. But since many of those lunch counters were part of larger chains up north, chains that depended on the business of African American customers, it only took 2 weeks before the Arlington lunch counters integrated. So NAG looked for its next target, and it was a pretty conspicuous one. Glen Echo Amusement Park had been around since the turn of the century, and everyone knew the jingle from the radio. There's probably many people in this room who could sing it with me. I won't sing it, but it's fun is where you find it. Glen Echo Amusement Park. But though the print ad said, "Come one, come all," that actually wasn't true. So NAG showed up on June 30th, 1960, 30 or 40 of them. And across the way, the sympathetic white neighborhood of Bannockburn had been alerted by Union allies, and they showed up too. Now, Bannockburn, it's worth noting, was built in the late 40s by cooperative-minded people who came from the labor unions to work in the New Deal administration. But there were housing covenants in D.C. that forbade the sale of houses to Jews, and so a large number of Jews settled in Bannockburn, which gave it the lovely nickname Jewtown. Years before NAG arrived at Glen Echo, many in Bannockburn boycotted the park. In the late 50s, you can find letters to the editor in the Washington Post condemning the park's whites-only policy. So Bannockburn didn't need to be asked twice when the picket line was set up. In the early evening, white allies bought tickets, and an hour later, a group of NAG's students climbed aboard the carousel. And it didn't start for half an hour. And then the security guards, who were semi-deputized as Montgomery County police officers, arrested 5 African Americans who refused to get off their carousel horses. The NAACP bailed them out of jail, and a summer of picketing was born. The film's title, Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round, comes from a line in the Langston Hughes poem, Merry-Go-Round. The next one is, where's the horse for a kid that's black? In addition to rescuing the story from oblivion, I want to understand the impulse to activism. Why did these people take a stand when so few others did? In some ways, I feel like I was raised to make this film. Some of you here knew my father, Les Trachtman. He was a labor organizer who specialized in developing trade unions in Africa. My father was a true New York Jewish liberal, a Brooklyn boy who found himself in the DC suburbs and who instilled in my brother and I the principles of social justice, of seeking the face of the other, of the power of organizing, and of gathering numbers to shake up the status quo. My dad would have quelled over this story. Now, since we're in a synagogue, I want to point out that few of the people on that picket line would identify themselves as religious. But there's something very religious about their dedication. We learn from the Bible about Abraham, the father of all of our religions, when he was first called by God. Now, he didn't have a relationship with God before this, nor did he ever hear his voice. But when God called him, Abraham didn't say, "What do you want?" He didn't say, "Ooh, now's not a good time. Could you come back later?" Abraham said, "Hineni, here I am. Here I am, ready to serve with my whole self." And this model of unwavering readiness to serve, without fetching, without resentment, without wondering where they were going or if they need a sweater or did he need to reschedule a place he should have been, this hineni is something that we're taught to admire. And I do. Because today, we are not activists that say hineni. We sign an internet petition and then we post it to our Facebook page, or we go on a march for a few hours. The Glen Echo pickets went on every day for 9 weeks, with only a few days off for strategic evaluation. It got up to 95 degrees that summer. The picket line was made up of students and dads coming after work and mothers who brought all of their kids and doctors and teachers and lawyers and preachers who definitely had better things to do. Every day they left their dishes in the sink, they put down the baseball gloves, and remember, there was no email and no social media, and so organizing happened by way of phone trees and knocking on neighbors' doors and meetings in church basements and in people's homes and handing out flyers. For me, this is the definition of hineni. But back to Abraham. I would never take away from Abraham and God, and certainly not here. But those two only had to overcome the mortal, supernatural being divide. The people on the picket line had a racial divide to cross in a world that was more segregated than one we can imagine. Most of the people on the picket line had actually never met a member of the other race. In DC of 1960, Jim Crow was in charge. If you were black, you could go into Woody's and you could buy a suit but you couldn't try it on in the dressing room. You couldn't play football for the Redskins until 1962. The football team of Washington, D.C., the center of enlightened America, was the last team in the NFL to integrate. So the people on the Glen Echo picket line, I'd say they had chutzpah. They were brave enough to reach across the social distinctions that had defined their lives. And while it wasn't without incident, they worked together. Congress could learn a lot from them. I grew up knowing the greatness of Martin Luther King and a handful of other heroes from the civil rights movement. As a Jewish girl, I saw the pictures of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching next to Dr. King at Selma. And I learned about Andy Goodman and Mickey Schwerner, the Jewish Corps field workers who, along with James Chaney, were murdered in Mississippi. But I didn't know about thousands of Jews and other white allies in the movement who may not have traveled into the South or marched across the bridge in Selma, but who in their neighborhoods and their schools, their houses of worship, their swimming pools, and yes, their amusement parks, stood up for fairness. I didn't know regular people did that. And so this story of the protests at Glen Echo draws me inexorably because it's a small story. It's a story that ultimately involved a few hundred people directly in the fight to integrate the local amusement park. Now, there are some hugely significant historical outcomes. Several historians have told me that this was the first time a black student group and a white community stood together to protest in history. Glen Echo was also an incubator. 10 young people who were initiated into the movement on that picket line became 1961 Freedom Riders, enduring unspeakable horrors in the Deep South. And those 5 people arrested on the carousel had their case heard by the Supreme Court in 1964. Now, even though those outcomes alone warrant real academic examination, it's the smallness of the event that speaks to me, because this is the opportunity to meet and know real people that stood up for what mattered. Because the value of learning about real people is that we can't dismiss them. Extraordinary heroes are important because they're aspirational, but they risk teaching us that one has to be exceptional to take on the status quo. We can excuse ourselves from our own moral obligations because we aren't like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or John Lewis, because their very greatness gives us a kind of pass. We can sort of look away, let ourselves off the hook, and say, I could never do that. But when we hear about what drove regular people, we start to recognize ourselves in the small details. And then, when we recognize ourselves, then we really care and wake up and get inspired. Here's a few of those kinds of details. Antonia Lewis, who thought of herself as a Howard University good girl who didn't cause trouble. She told me that until she sat at that lunch counter, reading her book, being called terrible names, she described herself as a good girl, but then viscerally, she felt something inside herself stiffen. And she said, darn it, that's not what she said. I'll sit here until hell freezes over. And then discovering that she had that strength carried her for the rest of her life. Or Lauren Weinberg, who at 16 was forbidden by his parents in Bannockburn from joining the picket. But as he stood in the crowd watching, his knees started shaking. And he felt himself, almost out of body, enter that vast empty space between the gawkers and the picketers. And he was shaking harder until he reached the picketers and started walking, and someone handed him a sign and he fell into stride, and his knees stopped shaking. And Lauren said to me, my bar mitzvah didn't make me a man, but walking in that picket line did. The thing about Glen Echo is that everyone heard that jingle. It was on the radio for years, all the time. Come one, come all. And everyone knew it was a lie. But most people were inured to it. I think about that. And the fact that there are virtually millions of injustices in our faces that we've stopped seeing. I want people to see this movie. I want to make this movie so that people are inspired to see and stand up, even if it's scary, Because here's another detail that really moves me, told to me by Rocky Delaplaine, who was 7 when she was picketing with her mother and her 4 siblings. People threw bottles at them from passing cars and yelled horrible things, and Rocky was scared. But she looked around, and she saw her neighbors and her community picketing with her, and she felt safe. Because at 7, Rocky told me, she learned in her bones that the safest place to be in the world is in the middle of a group of people who are standing up for what's right. I think about that Margaret Mead quote. It's so true that it's a cliche. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
I wasn't thinking about picketing one January morning in 1960 when I got a knock on the door from a classmate of mine from high school who said, "It's a lovely morning this morning. How would you like to go picketing?" And that was the first I ever thought of that.
It wasn't hard at all. And I didn't have a fearful moment because of the solidarity and the opportunity that these black students were offering to us was such a gift.
Success and progress doesn't come overnight. It's incremental. One generation has to lay the bedwork for the next generation. So it's a slow process. And sometimes, we get, bored, or we feel like a failure when the next generation does not pick up the baton.
Lift down, overcome.